There are a number of accounts by many Americans and Israelis who were at the talks. I'm going to quote just two of the Americans. Aaron David Miller served 6 secretaries of state as advisor on the Arab-Israeli peace process. Quoting Ehud Barak's chief negotiator at Camp David, Miller said, quote, "In the words of Shlomo Ben Ami, the Prime Minister's idea of the concessions required of Israel for such a sweeping accord fell far short of even modest Palestinian expectations." End of quote. Former ambassador to Israel, Ned Walker, said, of the ideas discussed at Camp David, "There is no way in hell the Palestinian people would have accepted this thing." End of quote. The next argument, another example of alleged rejectionism, is the Palestinians rejected the 1947 partition plan, UN Resolution 181. Morally compromised for failing to obtain the consent of the indigenous people, Resolution 181 gave 56% of British Mandate Palestine to the Jewish people, who owned less than 7% at the time, and 43% to the Palestinians, with the remaining 1%, Jerusalem and Bethlehem, under the authority of the United Nations. The argument is that Jewish acceptance and Palestinian rejection proves that the Jewish side wanted peace and the Palestinian side did not. Therefore, the Palestinians are to blame for this never-ending conflict. One of the assumptions of this argument is that Israel would have been content to exist on 56% of Palestine with a divided Jerusalem. Israel has never been content existing on the 78% of Palestine it has controlled since 1949. And Palestinian rejection of partition in 1947 does not excuse Israeli confiscation of Palestinian land in 2011. A Jewish state based upon partition would have had an initial 49% Arab minority, which would quickly have become a majority. It is utterly naive to think that Israel would have accepted such an outcome. In fact, in December 1947, David Ben-Gurion pledged to his political party that the borders established by 181 were not final. In other words, acceptance of 181 was a tactical decision and a prelude to future expansion. Following Ben-Gurion's lead, Yigal Allon, soon to become the most prominent general of the 1948 war, stated, "The borders of partition cannot be for us the final borders. The partition plan is a compromise plan that is unjust to the Jews. We are entitled to decide our borders according to our defense needs." End of quote. Does this sound familiar? This is exactly what Benjamin Netanyahu has been saying since he became prime minister in 2009. Netanyahu's logic is that making peace with the Palestinians on the basis of the 1967 borders and normalizing relations, hold on one second, and normalizing relations with the entire Arab world threatens peace, while seizing more and more Palestinian land secures peace. My logic is that persisting in the same strategies that instigated the conflict in the first place can never secure peace, and the kind of thinking exemplified by Benjamin Netanyahu is the greatest threat to peace anywhere. Moving on to the next argument. And I hear these arguments constantly. If you read the newspapers, like Jewish Federation newspapers, like the one in New Mexico that I sometimes force myself to look at, and other pro-Israel newspapers, these are the arguments you're going to hear. The reason hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled their homes in 1948 is because the region's Arab leaders instructed them to do so. Therefore, Israel is not responsible for the Palestinian refugee problem. This argument implies that if Arab leaders had not instructed Palestinians to leave, the Jewish army would have allowed them to stay. If that had been the case, there would have been more Palestinians in Israel than Jews, spoiling the Zionist dream of a Jewish state. From a historical perspective, in 1959, Professor Walid Khalidi proved the claim to be a total fabrication. His findings were independently corroborated 2 years later by Irish scholar and UN diplomat Erskine Childers. By examining the archives of the Arab governments and newspapers and the reports of the CIA and BBC, which monitored every Arab radio broadcast of 1948, both men demonstrated that no such instruction had been given. To the contrary, Arab broadcasts appealed to Palestinians not to leave their homes. Disinformation like this has influenced Westerners to dismiss the Palestinian people's al-Nakba, or catastrophe, and to slander them as propagandists and liars. And when Israel was asked by the UN, by the way, did I say this? I don't think I did. When Israel was asked by the UN to provide evidence supporting their claim, they could not come up with a single iota of evidence. The next argument. As many Jews were forced to leave their homes in Arab countries as Palestinians leaving Israel. The ultra-religious Shas party has admitted that in promoting this argument, its goal has been to foil any possible peace deal between the Palestinians and the Israelis. The thrust of this argument is to demean the Palestinian people's history of suffering and to implicate them in Jewish emigration, which they had absolutely nothing to do with. Jewish emigration was a reaction to Israel's expulsion of Palestinians. The majority of Jews who left their homes in Arab countries left of their own accord, many because they heeded Israel's offer of free transportation and housing. Israel recruited these immigrants in order to build a strong Jewish majority. Many had time to gather their possessions, and many were compensated with possessions stolen from Palestinians. Additionally, in order to frighten Iraqi and Egyptian Jews into emigrating, Israel's Mossad planted bombs made to look like the work of Arab terrorists in Jewish neighborhoods in Baghdad and Cairo. The next argument, the colonization of Palestinian territory is in keeping with God's promise to the Jewish people. First of all, when Israel signed on to the Fourth Geneva Convention, it willingly became bound by its conditions, which do not provide an exemption for any nation to exploit its religion or any philosophy in the service of dispossessing another people. This convention, which was adopted in 1949 in response to Nazi atrocities, explicitly prohibits an occupying power from transferring parts of its own population into the territories it occupies. For Israel to breach its provisions, which are designed to lessen the insanity that necessarily accompanies armed conflict, is itself an atrocity. Secondly, throughout the Torah are prohibitions against scheming, stealing, and breaking contracts, as well as a practice known as tikkun olam, or repairing the world, in which every Jew is obligated by his religion to rectify injustice. This is how the world is made into a dwelling place for the divine. The next argument, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Attempting to divert attention from Israel's undemocratic policies, this argument professes Israel's moral superiority in order to conceal, with regard to its treatment of non-Jews, its moral inferiority. Try telling Palestinians anywhere in Israel-Palestine that they live in a democracy. Any definition of Israel's political structure cannot hide, cannot magically disguise the inequality that is